Welcome to the Voice of MPE. In this MPE Talk series, we bring you fresh insight from top industry leaders and payment professionals. Today, I have the privilege to have a virtual sit down with a fantastic leader in payment security, Candice Pressinger. Good afternoon, Candice. How are you doing?
Good afternoon, Sandra. Great to be here with you today. Hope you're well.
Absolutely. It's a real pleasure. This is the second time that we get to do some sort of virtual chat together. And today it's a topic that we are both passionate about, payment security. I think what would be really interesting for the audience out there that don't necessarily know you, although you're quite influencer in your own right within that space, just give us a bit of a background in terms of your role and the aspect of security that you're looking after today.
Sure. I've been at Elavon US Bank now for 8 years. I joined Elavon as their Director of Customer Data Security, and at that time it was very much focused on industry standards and regulation. But as time has moved on, the landscape has changed enormously, and I no longer just look after compliance, I look after security, fraud, and optimization.
Amazing. So you're the perfect person then to take us through a whole journey. You mentioned regulations where you started. Will be good to get, your perspective, given the complexity and the industry challenge that we're seeing today within the space. How are you seeing the impact and how much regulation is essentially shaping, the trends that we are seeing emanating in this space or evolving?
Yeah, well, in my role at Elavon, we are a global acquirer and I look after all our European and global merchants. The complexity of the global payment regulations is immense. Each region enforces its unique rules, whether it's GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. It's in every different European country. They have a different modus operandi. Take Europe. Separate from North America, we have Payment Services Directive, PSD2, where we all have to enforce strong customer authentication. This is very different to what our North American friends have to implement. It means for merchants, and especially global merchants, that they need to adopt a compliance strategy that's flexible and consistent.
Absolutely.
And partnering with the right payments provider who's experienced in helping a merchant navigate these differences is absolutely paramount and will make all the difference to a seamless customer experience.
I love that you essentially pinpointed how different this approach can be from a region perspective, because you're right, sometimes the regulation is supporting essentially the effort, right, that we're seeing in terms of the technology that gets mandated. And in other areas, it's essentially a real need because they are dealing with such a massive, exposure to risk and security that they sort of need to come together as an industry. I think from a European perspective, we sit at a very interesting cornerstone, of the different regions because we have a mandate, right? You've mentioned PSD2, you've mentioned GDPR, which are very different. We're seeing that there is initiatives that are also arising in other regions that have a very similar framework. Can you give us a bit more, because you've been that close to the regulations, etc. Can you kind of give a bit of some of the lessons and what you've observed, and how much do you actually potentially see that regulations is a key driver to essentially maintain and guard the security of ecosystem, and how much that can actually still enable innovation to happen, right? Because there's always that friction between how much secure the environment needs to be versus the friction, right, that it potentially, sort of expose the user to.
And that's what I meant when I said that I moved really from the security and compliance in its purest sense to optimization, because now with the advent of artificial intelligence and fraudsters, criminals becoming more and more sophisticated, the need for security is so much greater, but then the balance between security and frictionless and customer experience is a really difficult one to actually achieve. I mean, I think certainly PSD2, where we've seen the implementation of SCA exemption, strong customer authentication, we have things in place to enable that and frictionless by using transaction risk analysis to do exemptions where appropriate. And I think that the the products and services we have as an industry can really help to strike that balance for our merchants. And I think since PSD2 was implemented, there is still some friction, but we see that 75% of all e-commerce spend in the European Union is authenticated, and we estimate, or sources estimate, that well over $1 billion fraud has been prevented since the advent of the regulation, and are lifting e-commerce approval rates by 2.5%, which clearly for merchants is excellent. But we're always evolving and looking how we can, strike that balance for the merchants.
Yeah, no, I love all those numbers, fairly striking numbers, and just, hearing those numbers highlights the depths of the issue and why security is a core topic. I think when I look at how long, I think you said, was it 10 years at 𝗏𝗏, did you mention? Okay, but
nearly, not quite, but yeah, thereabouts.
Okay, you're on that road. But you were exposed already to sort of like the security payment side before 𝗏𝗏, right? In your previous role, you were already sort of leaning towards that.
I was Director of Fraud and Security at BT Group, and I was literally only responsible for securing the 27 platforms and the 80 third-party service providers against the PCI DSS and various components to mitigate the Data Protection Act at that time. It wasn't much about the experience and balancing security, but really just tightening down the environments.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you've had this both perspective, because from where I'm sitting, obviously I've always been involved pushing solutions towards the merchants. And I've seen quite a shift between how security has been positioned in conversation, right? Back 15, 20 years ago, right? It was almost, it is a mandate. We need to comply. We need to tick boxes. So it's you can't contravene. You need to essentially establish a framework that enable or allow you to just, stay as compliant as possible with all the different mandates. But what I'm seeing today, it's security has become such a prominent topic, and the figures that you've just quoted essentially highlight that it's driving the conversation, right? Because security has an implication with the user experience, with, the reputation beyond, just the actual losses. And I think that shift is really interesting, because it's sometimes the actual reason why you see certain shifts, in terms of providers, in terms of platforms, because security has become, it's kind of funny to say in the same sentence, but it is a driver of innovation. Is the way you also see and interpret what of, some of the shifts you're seeing?
Absolutely. And as I said, my role has shifted fundamentally, because security is core now to any payment solution, and it should enhance it rather than hinder the user experience. Merchants can now have access to a whole raft of tools, tokenization, biometric authentication, transaction risk analysis, as I mentioned, and they allow for strong security, but without the unnecessary friction that comes with those. And it should be a silent partner. Security should be there that builds that layer of trust and enables merchants to maintain their brand reputation and customers, to have a seamless experience. Striking the balance does take thoughtful implementation, but I look after a product suite. So, for example, we look at fraud being a major emergent threat to our merchants' costly chargebacks, and it's a big, big problem for all the C-suite that I encounter. And we need to look at security as a means of actually weeding out the rubbish, if you like, and making sure that we don't block good customers in that process. And therefore, so reducing costs, reducing friction, and ultimately increasing the bottom line. So security is a real means of optimization, and it's something that I discuss with an awful lot of the merchants that I'm dealing with more and more, and they're proactively asking how we can help them with these things.
I think it's such a key word there, proactively. I think sums it up, right? It is actually not just about sitting across the standard and the mandate and the radar, but really sort of trying to preempt and stay at the very forefront of whatever could be next. And with that, when we think about how broad, diverse, and global the ecosystem is today, the diverse payment options. So you've mentioned a number of security mitigation measures that there is in the industry. Some of those new emerging alternative payment methods have a very appealing, I suppose, standpoint, because maybe they are, less expensive than cards, or maybe they are being positioned as an easier way to, to convert to, checkout, get the customer to pay for the, for the transaction. But there is also a bit of an unknown, I think, for me, when we go beyond or outside of the card rails with the diverse range of payment options. I think there is definitely an area there where there is not necessarily a standard, and that's potentially a challenge even for merchants. I mean, do you have any sorts of advice or any sorts of first-hand insight in terms of how do we navigate that? Right, it's one thing to understand, comply within your region and get familiar with some of the core instruments like cards, but then as you operate globally, there's such a fragmented ecosystem with these different payment options, with different providers. Any thoughts, any perspective you could share there?
Yeah, I think, as you say, it's and the same with security, as it's all around meeting needs and interoperability, the fragmentation and the regulation. Everything is becoming a double-edged sword. So payment options, the explosion of the APMs, global payment options, is a double-edged sword. It does enable merchants to cater to diverse needs in local markets, but then, as we touched on, security and user experience are all part of that thinking. So working with the right payment gateways that unify multiple payment methods can definitely alleviate this kind of thing by streamlining the processes and actually enhancing oversight into local regulation and different pitfalls that they might encounter. And I think, examples of these things, all local wallets, Alipay, China, in China, Klarna in Europe, they are fantastic tools, reaching specific markets, but each one comes with a unique security and compliance requirement. Game changers, but something that makes everything slightly more complicated.
Yeah. And today, there's some obvious, enhancement and advancement that are shaping or shaking the ecosystem. The use of AI, right? Mm-hmm. It's not only, driving efficiencies from the processing standpoint, but also from securing and helping potentially emulate or getting faster at tracking patterns. What is your view on that as well, in terms of, do you really see a huge potential to essentially finally get ahead of some of those sophisticated trends? Because AI equally help businesses to get more efficient, but it's also increasingly being used by fraudsters to become more sophisticated in exploiting some of the vulnerability. And the vulnerability, I think, translates itself a lot in new territories, right? When they go to new markets, they expand into new APMs, and they are dealing with new customers for whom they don't necessarily understand the profile, their risk profiling, right? That's where potentially AI, is that the solution? Any perspective in terms of?
Yeah, I think as we're saying, double-edged sword, for each new payment option, the added opportunity, but then there's the added security requirements. And I've talked about this at other events. It expands the attack vector, and fraudsters, they look for inconsistencies. They look for the weakness. So, for example, I see a big spike in fraud with loyalty points accounts, because they're not protected as well as other accounts. And so the fraudsters are using artificial intelligence to scrape the data and then, perpetrate identity fraud and change phone numbers. And they're getting very, very sophisticated. And I think these tools are being used by the fraudsters very cleverly. It's sad, but it is quite ingenious. But equally, and I look after 𝗻𝗲, I look after our advanced fraud solutions, machine learning models and artificial intelligence ways of looking at how we can track and trap fraudsters by looking at patterns. So the way we used to look at things was looking at a cardholder, some rudimentary rules, some blacklists, and just, blocking. But the tools and artificial intelligence enabling us to do now is looking at huge amounts of fraud signals, building big, graph analysis networks to look at the cardholder and everything they're connected to. It's sort of like FBI technology that stops the fraud and the chargeback before they can even happen. And that's really where we're using these things at present.
Amazing. Is there any other technology? Because AI is huge. AI, ML, we literally see this popping in, not just being embedded into the traditional, sort of like payment model as a layer to it, but they are essentially really building a strong ecosystem of their own right? Whereby clients, merchants are really looking at making that the prime core layer of the infrastructure to which then the acquiring and all of the, I would say, the commodity sorts of services to process the cards sit and connect to. It's really, I guess you've mentioned certain innovations, so which is literally just the technology, the infrastructure that are also helping, the AI being, one of them. Is there anything else that you find particularly interesting, or that you have a particular interest in terms of, early conversation, how these are shaping and potentially unexploited potentials within some of the other instruments that are, shaping up the mitigation measures for security?
Yeah, certainly network tokenization is one of those. Things like click to pay type products, secure remote commerce, where that basically, and I think recently I've seen MasterCard with an ambitious target to remove PAN entry from e-commerce by 2030. I think certainly these things are all contributory to removing risk from merchants and cardholders alike. And those are the upcoming technologies that I'm working on as part of my portfolio as it happens. Yeah.
Amazing. Can we expect to see more, I suppose, socialization of those, core advancements? Because from where I'm sitting, right, both you and I have been in this space, and, we kind of like talk about all of those jargons as if it's like a very easy term to just, float around in a conversation. But I'm still thinking, on the other hand, as much as merchants are welcoming and seeing all of this innovation coming, there is, for me, probably still a little bit of a gap, right? In between all of the great flagship informations that are coming, saying that, this is being released and this is going to be, the game changer in terms of, really mitigating some of these exposure. But I still feel that the merchants are probably not necessarily following at the pace at which the industry seems to be pushing the evolution, right? And for me, of course, I think education is one of the key aspects. Any thought or any potential initiative that you are as well yourself seeing and grasping in terms of how do we connect those great solutions and how can we truly start seeing adoption and really, the majority, or if not the whole industry, starting to really utilize those, those leverage against the fraudsters?
Well, certainly part of my remit is education, merchant education. And as we talk to them around, security in general, we talk to them about all the tools that are available to them. And it is an ecosystem responsibility to communicate out the ways that these things can actually benefit and how we are. And it's not just about security, as we talked about. It's about, every merchant wants to know how to increase their bottom line. And maybe it's the way that we talk about it. So, for example, more than 50% of cardholders abandon cart because the checkout's too complicated, or they don't want to set up an account, or it's average 23 clicks to, required for an online checkout. Or 40% of consumers use guest checkout because, due to security concerns, they don't want to store their data. So I think it's really helping merchants to understand how these tools are, we're not just selling them things, they are actually going to really help their end users to buy things frictionless and avoid cost of non-compliance and security breaches. I think that that's definitely the way that we look at socializing it.
I love what you said around it's probably how we say it, right? Because fundamentally, the concept of what it is made for, it's one thing, but how do we disseminate this information at the level of understanding of the merchant, speaking their language?
100%. And it's interesting actually when we talk about advanced fraud detection. I don't think people or merchants fully understand the optimization capability of having, say, a pre-authentication fraud detection solution, because ultimately it's enabling them to increase the number of acceptance, cards accepted, and to reduce the cost of the chargeback, and maybe, increase by 1% only, even just 1% of their bottom line by having a fraud detection solution. It's more about optimization. And that, as we said at the beginning, that security and technology, they're all a silent partner in helping a merchant to achieve that customer experience and frictionless and, loyalty that they're all striving to achieve.
Yeah, you're right.
It's not the technology, it's the use case.
Yeah, and you're so right when you say that it's marginal, right? We're talking about that 1% more that we can convert, that we can, retain. It's very much that, right? Because the margins across most of the, I suppose retail and travel, etc. segment, which 𝗪𝗲𝗻 is a big player into the space. It's not that they can turn around and all of a sudden inflate their price to the end customer by 2, 3, 5%, right? But those marginal gain that can be done by optimizing the infrastructure, considering the millions or billions of transactions, it's absolutely substantial and significant. So really, really interesting. And for me, such a privilege to be sitting, virtually with you, picking up your brain. And unfortunately, we're just literally getting to the end of that. But you are going to be coming to MP next year.
I am.
We definitely can take this conversation forward. Any last word you want to say to the community, the merchants, in terms of whether it's anything that you're looking forward to or whether it's any advice or imperative that you would leave as recommendation? So any last words?
Yeah, I think it's a very exciting industry. It's more open than it's ever been. Big players, niche innovators, we're all coming together as an ecosystem, and we can deliver meaningful change. And that's what excites me. It is that interoperability and ultimately, making things better collectively for all our merchants and the industry players. I think the things that I'm looking forward to in 2025 is really helping to position optimization, as I mentioned, new advancements in security and authentication. We do have some new requirements in the PCI version 4 around e-commerce protection, and MasterCard's, bold ambition of removing PAN entry, network tokens, and just innovations, really. I just love the brilliance of our community and just getting to be a part of it, actually. So, yeah, and hearing from everybody at MPE.
And the industry is definitely, I suppose, very blessed to have players like you, leaders like you, taking part and engaging in those conversations. We will be seeing many of you at MPE next year between the 18th and the 20th of March in Berlin. Thank you so much for listening to this MPE Talk episode, which is part of the MPE 2025. There's a lot more conversation coming, so stay tuned, follow the page, register, come and engage with us at MPE next year.